We're back, ladies and gentlemen, with another CSGO map analysis video, this time on the new Ancient. It seems weird to put those two words together, but Valve have indeed updated the map to the surprise of nobody. However, to the surprise of me, and maybe I'm just being naive, Valve have also decided to remove Train, which might actually be the best map in terms of just pure map balance and map design. And I'll get into that maybe in a separate video to justify that claim, but they've removed Train and replaced it with Ancient, which is a map that has not been tested and is not even optimized, is not even finished, actually. So we're going to explore that in this video. Obviously, the professional side of things, the esports, the competition, that's what I'm mostly interested in when it comes to Counter-Strike. I don't personally even think this is the best version of the game we've had in terms of raw mechanics, and I see a lot of improvement that could be levied in this game. Unfortunately, with Valve taking a very heavy backseat and then only occasionally having very heavy-handed updates like this that completely change the way that the game is going to be played at the professional level, seemingly with no real consultation or discussion or communication, as is their right, of course, as the gods of the developers themselves. We have to consider what this is going to mean for the professional scene. And the fact that already we're seeing tournaments adopt the new map pool halfway through, in fact, in the case of the Eliza Invitational, where they just decided, fuck it, the second phase of our tournament, we'll have a different map pool. So if you qualified there, be prepared to have your skills and strengths invalidated. That's basically the signal that they are sending, of course, and that Valve themselves have sent by making it so that Train will persist in the map pool for the early RMRs and then move on away and be replaced by Ancient, presumably for the second phase of RMRs as well as the Major itself. It's all speculative because just in peak Valve fashion, they don't bother communicating anything, as we've come to expect. So let's get into Ancient specifically. That's why you're all here. You saw the tweet or you saw the Reddit post or whatever. We're here to talk about Ancient. Ancient is a map that really does feel like what I assume a Valorant map feels like. I won't levy too much criticism towards that game in this video because I've only seen some analysis of the maps themselves, and they essentially talk about how one of the ways that they combated Peeker's advantage was to reduce the number of safe spots that you had. So it was impossible to isolate angles and dry peek them one at a time, the way that you do, for example, entering out onto B from apps in Mirage, as just one example, or maybe anything in Train. Yeah, that's a map, was a map. So we're going to talk about why it's really important to have that opportunity as a player to clear out angles and then have some cover to fall back on for both aggressive and defensive players. But you also have to remember that in Counter-Strike, the CTs become the aggressors when they're trying to retake, which is one of the reasons why defensible sites like Dust2's B bomb site, or indeed Ancient's A bomb site, as we'll get into, are so difficult to retake because of the fact that it's so easy to lock them down, even with a little bit of utility. So when the Ts finally do crack the site and take control of it, it then becomes significantly harder for CTs to justify it, particularly with the economy that we have. I suspect, as with any map that's been freshly added to the map pool, I would actually expect that for a while we'll see a T-sided dominant meta, which obviously doesn't work with Counter-Strike's core mechanics, as we've seen in general with maps like Vertigo, where obviously the Ts get off to a pretty good start, generally speaking, and have an easier time, and the CT economy is stressed because they have to buy nades more than they have to buy weapons, and so on and so forth. And because of that core imbalance, we do have to take the Brood War approach of balancing through maps themselves. And that's something that we've seen Valve essentially fail to do for quite a while, and something I would prefer actual TOs to just say, fuck it, we're clearly not going to be using a map like Ancient, which is not competitive ready, and probably won't be for quite some time. We'll let Valve experiment with the general populace in matchmaking, and maybe some professional players can test it on their free time, but for the most part, we'll just stick with our own map pool. That would have been nice, but obviously it's never going to happen in an industry of followers. So let's follow that rant by talking about the A-bomb site. So one of the changes to Ancient, obviously I did a map analysis video for the original version of Ancient when Broken Fang launched. This whole building is new, and you can kind of tell because the quality is not great on some of these assets, but as we get through into it, one of the things you'll notice is that there's absolutely no value in taking this particular area as a CT in a retake situation. There's no window, there's no way for you to impact the site. I suppose what you could do is throw some flashes off this window. That's about it. That's about as much as you're going to get. Otherwise, as a T, however, it does have some value because you can cut off rotations and peer into that mid connector, which allows you to stop any CTs from even approaching the A main, so to speak, area. I am going to assume you're somewhat familiar with Ancient's general layout, as obviously it has been in the game for a little bit, but I wouldn't blame you if you had decided to never play it at all. Or maybe you played it once and you don't remember anything else. You'll also notice that the soundscapes are still busted. Yes, they still randomly cut out depending on where you are in the map, and no, they do not have any more gracious transitions. It's obviously a minor note, but it's definitely going to annoy pro players who are constantly straining to hear every little sound, especially in the online era where there is no crowd noise to drown that kind of thing out. So this window is probably the biggest gameplay change in general. This backhaul situation in I would say holistically is probably the biggest change to the entire map, not just to the A bomb site. It doesn't really make the bomb site any more approachable for Ts, because obviously this is CT-sided territory, and if you do have mid control, you would much rather go through Lurk Temple than ever going through all the way through a CT spawn, as that opens you up to any rotations coming from the B site. So you want to just make it very quick and up tempo, which means you would want to take it through this mid Lurk Temple, as I've taken to calling it. Now, you do have this clone of K-Sharp, Dust 2, B site, Backplat, whatever you want to call it. This essentially is the same thing, and it's countered in the same way by simply having some sort of utility or winning a ridiculous aim duel. Visibility is not great on the map, but everybody plays with ridiculously oversaturated NVIDIA graphics card settings at the professional level, as I've found out. And their vibrance is going to be more than enough to likely make up for it. However, when you start to introduce skins, you can immediately figure out what the big problem is there. That's not really something I can criticize the map for, though, because I fail to buy into the premise that map makers should have to change the maps so that the skins don't offend visibility as much. I think very clearly there should just be a command to turn them off, and that would be the bare minimum expectation. The other one would be Valve actually puts in effort to make sure that they are readable, which obviously they're not interested in. Now, this main hall area is where some things get a little bit interesting for a very brief amount of time, mostly because of this elevation of the angle that you take when a T is rushing A. The timing is such that you'll hit this spot as a T, and this spot as a CT roughly at the same time, depending on spawns, of course. I haven't tested every single spawn, but I've tested enough of the rotations to know that that's roughly where the timings are. So I've left these helpful little frag grenades to help signify what that is. One of the other changes to this area was obviously to open this up, because it was very puzzling that you couldn't throw nades through this before, even though it was open. Now, they've opened it up a little bit more, I believe. However, one of the biggest issues is finding lineups, because just like every other map in the pool, this is sarcasm, by the way, there's no cover and there's nothing to line yourself up with. So obviously that's a staple of Counter-Strike maps. It looks like you're going to have to line yourself up without actually locking yourself into place, which is a bit more comfortable. And if you wanted to lock yourself into place, you'd be doing it somewhere over here, like this flank position, which I imagine ROPS will be very comfortable with. And then we're going to get deep into this position, and then you can start to lob some nades through. However, something you'll learn as you're trying to learn some nades on this map is that there's a ton of little specific elements of essentially the skybox where this extra detail looks okay, especially for CSGO standards, and at the same time ends up stopping your grenades from finding any utility. There's this bit that repeatedly intercepted all of my smoke grenades that I was trying to deploy through that little hall area. The other problem, of course, with throwing nades through this anyway, is that unless you're doing it with some tempo and then jumping out with it, there's not really any point to it, because you could just get pushed at any point. It's almost like a poor man's B-site entrance. Again, this does feel relatively copy-pasted from that map, where on Dust 2, you would just end up in a situation where, okay, yeah, you've got the ability to take this control in tunnels, and then you can throw nades through the opened-up windows or roofs, I guess, that Dust 2 had in a recent-ish update, maybe a couple months ago. That obviously feels like what they were going for here as well, but the problem is that it's much easier to get pushed on from this area. You would essentially have to, like, hold this side from back here, but because there's no way for you to, like, hold this right side angle without being opt from K-Sharp, then if somebody else, a rifler from A, comes in here, he could like hug the wall and do this. There's just so many different things that you have to watch out for, so you can very easily get timinged in this position if you're not careful. And CTs will want to be aggressive on this map, make no mistake. This is essentially very similar to Overpass, where CTs can have a lot of aggressive potential there. I would say it's a little bit over the line, however, though, because it doesn't really feel like the CTs themselves are a defensive side. It feels more like they are encouraged to always take more map control just because of the fact that the map has so many easy areas to lock down once you're there. You'll also notice that for whatever reason, the contrast, the boost player contrast function on this map makes things look very weird. Like this guy basically doesn't even have a shadow for some reason, and I'm not 100% sure why. I think maybe there was something bugged, actually, when I kept logging in and out of the world space by using no-clip, which, as you'll see, will slow any computer to a halt, even mine. So, bearing that in mind, performance is not great, optimization is not great on this map, definitely needs another pass. One thing that they will, you'll notice they did not fix is you still cannot jump up here. You still cannot go onto this bridge. You still cannot jump over here. You might think this is a nothing burger, but remind you, everything that is normally within basic reach of a jump seems to be totally accessible in a lot of other maps, even in places where it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. So you have to wonder why, then, Valve decided to leave all of these here and then do nothing with them. I mean, this would be a very thematic element if they wanted to push it further, even though, again, they're using 2D fucking planes for water. I don't know why, probably because source water is always a disaster. Speaking of disasters, the smoothing on basic stuff like this is a bit of a disaster. It's very easy to get caught on some of these depending on the angle that you pick. I, of course, can't reproduce it now because I'm recording a video where I'm dissing it, and now it will behave. But generally speaking, you walk up there enough times, which obviously you're going to as a T coming out of T spawn, it's going to happen more times than you can count, more times than anybody would be comfortable with. I would say the same thing is true about stuff like this, where, yeah, okay, they've smoothed it out so you don't have to jump, but it still feels very weird and to essentially right before you're going to take an angle, get this very abrupt and jerky movement to your camera. This is roughly speaking where a T will come out timing-wise if they're going mid from spawn. This is roughly where a CT will come out timing-wise if they're going mid from spawn. One of the things you'll notice is that a change to mid was to widen from here to here, and this essentially accomplishes a little bit of additional purpose given over to this spot, which previously was useless. Now you can hold this, take a shot, fall back, and you'll be safe, assuming you're able to get there. One of the things that you can do very easily coming out of this hall, you don't even have to stop, is just chuck some sort of incendiary over there, and when it actually lands, you have to aim a little bit lower than I just did there. What you're able to do is obviously either stop or hinder the position of any given T. I'll just nade that to mark the spot for later. And generally speaking, when you can do something like this, you're forcing whoever is leading the charge, assuming there is a mid-rush at all, to essentially be separated from anybody who would be coming behind him, as well as, of course, in general, stymieing the area and facilitating aggression. And that's essentially a rote task you're going to want to do every time you can afford an incendiary and you're the mid player. This is something we see on maps like Nuke and Overpass, where there's always this nade that at the pro level meta, you have to throw every single time you can, otherwise you're losing out on an advantage. And it's the hallmark of bad map design in general, because if you had to throw something over and over again to the point where a robot could do it with a higher degree of accuracy, then at that point it doesn't really matter who's doing it, it's always being done. There's no real element of strategy. You get a very minor, I would say false element of strategy when you have something like, oh, I chose not to throw it to make them think I couldn't afford it, or some sort of mind game like that. That's pretty much the only thing you can do if you want to play around with the strategic implications thereof. So generally speaking, yes, I know I said Overpass has an element of bad map design in it. I don't even think that's particularly arguable, but whatever you call that, there's a rote task you have to do every time with no variation if you want to stay afloat in mid. Assuming that there is a mid-rush, of course. Now, that's one of the areas where Overpass is maybe a little bit more egregious, because there's almost always somebody going Fountain, whereas there might not be somebody going mid every now and then on Ancient, but it still will happen most often. One of the reasons why is, of course, this area, which hasn't really been changed that much, has received a bit of additional cover. This is still a really annoying maze to navigate, and then it gets a lot worse when you go into the connector towards B, where this is probably even though it seems very simple, the fact that you're changing height levels so much and also directions at the same time and having to move your camera, or at least move your player, I guess you could do this. You'll get caught on the roof, you'll get caught on the architecture. Should probably just be opened up a bit more. And speaking of being opened up a bit more, besides my computer after this so that I can clean it out of all of the dust it's accumulated, I have to say, this area should have been opened up a bit more. My whole point about the incendiary grenade landing here and facilitating locking out players is that this was supposed to be widened so that that couldn't happen as easily, but it's still the same amount of happening. Oh, and speaking of things that catch your nades, I don't even know why this is here. I guess it's to facilitate some very specific flash that, like, pops through. But it's not like you can throw through this window into the other. So, I don't know. At least I don't have to look at the map for a few seconds when I flash myself in a video. One of the things that you'll notice is that this map just has a ton of shit that seems to be put there specifically to inconvenience you. Like, throwing something through this doesn't really facilitate anything. I guess you could come right up here, but then there's an invisible skybox volume that stops you from throwing the flashbang, so... yeah, there's no reason, actually. It's just there to fuck with you, which seems appropriate given the rest of this map. So, yeah, there's definitely some specific issues that need to be cleaned up. Those are probably some of the easier things, but unfortunately it is a pervasive element throughout the entire map, where you can be throwing a grenade like this, and then because maybe you hit the side of a rock or a side of a stone, it bounces in a completely unintuitive way like that. Where there's absolutely no way, even with the grenade preview, that I can even believe that. That's just goofy. And this happens all over the map. I'm not going to bother sending every single, nade possible to show you guys, but it does happen on both bomb sites, on the approach to both bomb sites, so on and so forth. It's just one of those areas where Valve tried to make the map look better than Source 1 is really capable of looking, I believe. And as a result, they've sacrificed optimization, performance, as well as sanity, at least when it comes to grenades. Grenades in CS, specifically the HE grenade, have already got a storied history of being being incomplete in an implementation space where you can throw it and then it gets caught by like some sort of brush or whatever. And as a result of like being behind a wall, it'll do like 50% less damage. So stuff like that just doesn't make any sense intuitively to how we would expect the HE to work. You don't need to fuck with it more by making your map essentially like worse for it. I understand that in a perfect world that just wouldn't happen. You wouldn't need to worry about that to the same degree. But just remember that this is Valve. This is their game. They know the engine and the game presumably better than any outside party. And yet they still made that basic mistake. We got some more HEs to essentially show you where... oh, wait, no, that one isn't an HE. This is about where you show up as a T. That's about where you show up as a CT. Just ignore that one. We'll burn that one so that it erases it from our memory. But remember, you still have to cross through this very long tunnel for no reason. I guess to drink in the visuals. But you have to do that every time. This is something that, like, the only problem with Train, basically, was that you have to walk for, like, 15 seconds to get to Ivy. And they basically do the same thing where you're walking for at least 5 seconds doing nothing. Not even turning. So that doesn't feel very good. Speaking of things that don't feel very good, they still haven't fixed the awkward rises and falls when you're walking down here. You literally, this is like if everybody equipped the Shadow Daggers and used them at once. Oh. You go up to go down, and down to go up. That's just how it works in CSGO, apparently. So, yeah, pretty stupid. There's some interesting angles that have been changed up or maybe discovered in the first place that I should give the devil their due as a result. In this particular case, obviously I mentioned that this opens up a line of sight into mid. You can also play this one and done angle where you're holding for somebody approaching from the B site. If you expect or you hear a call that they're coming in, you can actually hold here as an opper, take a shot, and then crouch and wait for them to come down here, assuming you missed or assuming there's another guy. The problem is you can't really fall back very easily. Like, you could take that shot and then try to run, but good luck getting around the corner before you get domed. So it still feels like there's not really that much cover, but at least that was an interesting element, right? It's an interesting line of sight that is achieved by essentially making everything the same level. In terms of like, oh, big playable space over here on B. Well, we got to make sure that it lines up with this playable space over here at the top of the mid house. I don't know why Valve decided to do that. There's these small, slight alterations of height all over the place, but for the most part, everything is very flat, and the lines of sight on the engagements are also very flat. Like, this isn't quite the... I'm actually getting stuck trying to leave. That's pretty impressive. This isn't quite at the same height level as this. It's slightly higher, but obviously when you hit this... back plat area, it's slightly higher than that as well. So yeah, there's some more variation, which you got to give them credit for, because before everything was very, very flat. And this whole area is a bit new anyway. Still, that being said, it's mostly playing on visibility issues at this point, and I don't really think that it's by any means a competitive ready map. the fact that people can't even run this map, obviously, like anybody who could only run Mirage, you better stay far the fuck away from this map, man. You'll never get this one running. I can't even get this one running above my monitor's refresh rate half the time, which is pretty embarrassing. So that should tell you all you need to know, and that's just with people like being idle and spawn or whatever. So it does get marginally more intensive the more players you got. That being said, really I think the key issues with the map come from elements like the rotations and, again, the very bizarre and labyrinthine manner that the angles are laid out. So obviously I referenced Valorant earlier half-jokingly, but it's stuff like this where you can't actually enter onto a bomb site and clear clear angles very easily. So this is a problem with, presumably, according to what people have told me, again, secondhand information, this is a problem with Valorant, where you come out here, and again, it's the straight line. It's essentially like if somebody took the B site tunnel and made it a straight line like everywhere else. And the police should come in and arrest them for that. But that's basically what we have here. It's the architecture is never really played around with in interesting ways. I get the thematic. It's supposed to be, you know, Aztec 2.0. It's supposed to be temple, ruins, whatever. The problem is that doesn't make for interesting and exciting gameplay when everything is a straight line, essentially a box or a rectangle. You can even tell based on the mini-map layout, it almost looks like a map from like 2015 or something, before people figured out how to make more exciting and interesting angles and play around with these boxes by adding smaller little bits of cover that change the angles as well, and maybe rotating them like this. Every piece of cover on this map is essentially just a crate. And for one, that's boring, especially in a thematic when you have this. Like, this is probably the only piece of cover that isn't a crate, and it's still a little too much the same. But, you know, you could chisel away at some of this stuff. You could say that it fell into disrepair. You could have a ramp here instead of a box or something. I don't know. There's so many different things you could do to make this a little bit more exciting. But the fact that they haven't unified the thematic whatsoever between, obviously, the Mayan Aztec thing, whatever they got going on here, and then the new construction stuff. Like, this is an example of an element where, okay, this could create some interesting angles. Oh, wait, I can't actually jump on it or jump around it or use it for anything. The most I can do is sit here and hold for somebody rotating out quad. That's basically it. At that point, it's not very, it's not leveraged correctly. I gave this suggestion on stream recently where you could just open up some of these and make it so that you could walk in here, even though it would still be another box, another set of straight line hallways. You could still use that in an interesting way to change how the map actually plays and allow for some cover and allow for some aggressive positioning in retakes, as well as just in surprise bomb site defenses. We don't really have any of that here. The CTs are encouraged to take forward-facing map control and try to starve the Ts out. It's actually surprisingly easy, especially on the B site. And then on the A site, I mean, you only really need 2 people to hold that most of the time, until people start to define the meta with some new nades and stuff that will flush them out of common positions. And yes, it's very early on, and yes, we haven't even seen proper pro play on it yet, but it's just not ready for that. It's far from ready for that. I don't even know if it will be ready for that. Remember that Vertigo was added more than 2 years ago, and it's still not ready for pro play, but we've had to deal with it anyway. I very much fear that something similar is going to happen to Ancient. And it's a really common tautology that people will bring up Overpass and say, well, Overpass was terrible at the beginning too. It doesn't have to be this way, guys. I don't know if you know this, but it's possible to make a map that is better than Overpass on launch, or Vertigo on launch, or Ancient on launch. In fact, many of them exist as community maps. A lot of them would be better fits for maps like for competitive play than this. You know, I've recommended Iris and Basalt and Engage plenty of times, and everybody's going to have some issues with those maps, but I guarantee you they will lend better to competitive play than this, another 3-lane map made entirely of rectangles with very little in terms of interesting engagements. Remember, this is one of the most interesting engagements in the game. It's still a straight line, but at least there's kind of an angle going on there, and also this. Wow, one of the only cases of an angled wall, and it's an interesting angle to take and play around. Valve, you guys are rediscovering things that we learned in 2016. I'm very proud of you. Obviously, the fact that they don't even play around with, like, non-architecture, essentially, like more organic stuff like this is infinitely more interesting to me, walking up. and then maybe taking an angle in. If that was actual gameplay space, if that was maybe a path to a bomb site, I mean, for one, it would reinforce the theme a lot better. And for another, it would simply just be superior than walking in a straight line again. Okay, I get to turn. Oh, I get to turn again. Well, I'm walking in an angle now. Oh, back to a straight line. No, straight line, straight line. It's always a straight line. You know, you got to get a little curvy. Maybe Valve just only likes straight things. I don't know. I would prefer a little bit of curvature, man. You can have voluptuous maps. Do not voluptuous map shame. I don't really know where else to sink my teeth into in this map, to be honest. I think the biggest issue are definitely some of the angles and how boring and flat everything is. And that seems to be very core to the element of the map, like the architecture, the theme. That's where Valve have decided to stake their claim. But I don't think it works in Counter-Strike. I think it's a little bit too flat, a little bit too one-dimensional, and I don't think that's ever going to change, no matter how many times they tweak it. They would essentially have to tear out a lot of the art and rebuild it from, maybe not scratch, but from pieces. And it definitely didn't need to be like this. Maybe it's a bit easier due to their workflow changes, but this is all ignoring the elephant in the room, which is, as I've mentioned before, optimization. If people can't play your map because they can't get above 60 FPS or whatever their monitor refresh rate might be, then at that point, they are not going to play your map, and you're going to see record low play times, just like people on Vertigo, actually. Although, I imagine that's less to do with performance and more to do with the map being shit. That being said, I don't know what's going to happen with pros. I imagine a lot of people will permaban this. However, a lot of underdogs are going to try to pick it, or at least leave it open, so that they call the bluff of a team that should beat them on paper, and then they'll be able to leverage the fact that, well, this is the online era, and this is a map that nobody's played that much on, so we should be able to potentially, beat you. This is the underdog puncher's chance, right? That being said, maybe this map will change my mind and grow on me a little bit, but the changes, while in general they have been positive, like the new angle and mid, and I would just say, like, the fact that there's not one entrance into the A-bomb site for CTs, if they've already lost mid, that's pretty good. That could have been done before. Like, I don't think you needed to release the map before doing that, but whatever. It does feel like whoever's responsible for this map hasn't really thought it through, and that's a criticism that I'm very seldom going to make about somebody like, well, literally Valve, a map maker or map makers at Valve. In theory, they would have some sort of ulterior theme that they're referring back to, but it doesn't feel like that's been the case with Ancient. It feels like, in general, they didn't have much of a plan. They laid out the floor plan, and they stuck to it, and they didn't really think about how it would play as much as they thought how it would look. And that seems to have been Valve's focus with this map, which is why we have such poor performance and seemingly absent optimization. I'm sure they had to do a lot of hacks to make this work in Source 1. And while you can applaud them for the work that went into doing something like that, it doesn't matter nearly as much as making a map that's actually enjoyable to play. And they could have done that without this, without leaving us with this, without removing Train, which, sure, statistically might be a seldom queued map, but as somebody who only really gives a shit about the competitive side of things, I can't say that it was a sensible removal. Again, I'll return to that concept in a later video, but Train is probably the best map in the professional map pool as of a couple days ago, just based on the fact that there isn't as many rote things that you have to do every single time. You gotta watch some angles, but that's sort of inseparable from attack shooter. You don't have to throw a grenade at this time, at this place, every round that you have that grenade. There's at least some variety there. It's certainly no Inferno, it's certainly no Overpass, it's certainly not Nuke with you throwing an incendiary at HUD every round. And as a result, yeah, Ivy was a bit of a shit show in terms of you holding W the whole time, but that's the biggest complaint that I had about that map, and the only legit one that I've seen people field since it's been removed. Other people simply just said that they don't like it. I don't want to poison the well and say the reason why they said that was because they're bad at the map, because I'm bad at the map and I still liked it, and I'm sure people can be bad at the map without disliking the map for that reason, but it does seem a little suspicious that most of the people who were hating on Train were shitters who didn't understand Train. So there you go. That's my take on Ancient and a little bit of a take on Train's removal. I'll get into Train specifically a little bit later on this channel. In the meantime, I guess you can queue Ancient if you want to go to sleep or something. I wouldn't recommend it, and I certainly wouldn't recommend spending $1 for a monthly subscription to shit that you can get for free elsewhere. Check out Launder's Twitter if you want to know what I'm talking about. And that's that. Bye.